I kept my $17,500 monthly salary a secret from my fiancé. To him, I was just a girl living simply with a baby. I wanted to see how he treats a poor single mom by pretending to be broke and naive. He invited me to the family dinner, but as soon as I walked through the door, the air turned to ice. Patricia Whitmore stood in the foyer, her eyes scanning my clearance rack sweater. She calculated my net worth in 3 seconds flat. The mansion smelled of expensive lilies and old, inherited secrets. My scuffed flats felt like lead weights on the pristine marble floors. Graham squeezed my hand, his palm sweaty against mine. He whispered that everything would be fine, but his voice lacked conviction. Patricia didn't offer a greeting or a smile. She simply turned her back and glided toward the dining room. I followed her, holding baby Rosie tighter. I realized then that I was not a guest. I was a specimen. We sat at a table long enough for a boardroom meeting. Crystal glasses caught the light, throwing sharp, jagged diamonds across the white cloth. Graham's sister, Sloane, smirked while scrolling through her phone. She looked up and asked what I did for a living with a predatory grin. I stuck to the script and mentioned my part. Time-filing job at a dental office. The table went silent. Patricia set her fork down with a rhythmic, metallic click. The interrogation had officially begun. Patricia leaned forward, her pearls glowing like cold teeth. She asked about Rosie's father with a forced, polite curiosity. I told her he was out of the picture and money was tight. Sloane laughed softly into her wine glass. Graham tried to change the subject to the weather. But his mother ignored him. She was focused on me, searching for a crack in my humble facade. I kept my eyes down, playing the part of the overwhelmed mother. Then, Sloane dropped a digital bomb. Sloane announced that she could find absolutely nothing about me online. No social media, no professional history, nothing. It was as if I didn't exist before meeting Graham. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral. I claimed I couldn't afford a fancy phone or data plans. Patricia exchanged a knowing look with her husband. They saw a blank slate they could easily erase. I realized they weren't just judging my poverty. They were actively planning my quiet exit. The tension broke when Rosie spit up on the antique Persian rug. The white stain spread quickly across the intricate red wool. Patricia's left eye twitched, a tiny fracture in her perfect mask. She told me to take the child to the laundry room immediately. Her voice was a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. Graham started to stand up, but his mother's glare pinned him to his seat. I walked away alone, feeling their eyes on my back. Patricia followed me into the dark hallway. Patricia shut the heavy laundry room door with a sharp click. The small space felt like a tomb. She leaned against a dryer, her pearls catching the fluorescent light. There was no warmth left in her expression. She pulled a leather checkbook from her pocket. The gold pen in her hand looked like a weapon. I held Rosie close, feeling the baby's heart racing. Patricia began to write. She didn't look at me. The air was thick with ozone. I watched her hand move across the paper with practiced grace. She spoke without lifting her head. She called me a professional parasite. Her voice was low and dangerous. She told me she knew exactly what I was doing. I was a trap for her son. She finished the check and tore it out. The sound was like a bone snapping. She held the paper out. It was for $50,000. This was my exit fee. I stared at the numbers on the page. It was a joke to me. I made that much in 3 months at the dental lab. But I kept my eyes wide and watery. I acted shocked. I asked if she really thought I would leave Graham for money. She laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. She said everyone has a price. She told me a girl like me would never see this much wealth again. I hesitated. Her smile grew cold. She thought she had won. I looked at the check again. I saw the bank logo. It was the same bank where I kept my private business accounts. I wondered if she would recognize my name on the elite member list. I chose to stay in character. I told her Graham would be devastated. She didn't care. She told me he would find a girl of his own kind. The door opened suddenly behind us. Graham stood in the doorway, his face pale. He looked at the check in my hand. He looked at his mother's smug face. The silence was absolute. Patricia didn't flinch. She told him she was helping me find a better future. Graham walked over and took the paper from my fingers. He ripped it into tiny white pieces. He didn't say a word to her. He just looked at me. His eyes were full of a new fire. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the hallway. We walked past the dining room without stopping. Sloane watched us with her mouth open. Patricia screamed his name, but he didn't turn back. We reached the heavy front door. He pushed it open, and we stepped into the cool night. He told me he was done with them. He was choosing us. He didn't care about the money. I felt a pang of guilt. He was truly sincere. We reached his car and he fumbled with the keys. He was shaking. I realized he had just walked away from everything for a lie. He believed we were going to be homeless. He promised me he would find a way to take care of us. I looked at the ring on my finger. It was fake, just like my life. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from the lab. A new emergency had arrived. The car engine roared to life as Graham sped away from the mansion gates. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned bone white. He didn't look back at the sprawling estate or the fountain lights. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the blue light of my phone screen. The emergency text from the lab was urgent. A high-profile reconstruction case needed my expert hands by dawn. My double life was starting to fracture under the pressure. Graham turned onto a dark secondary road and pulled over. He leaned his forehead against the wheel and took a ragged breath. He apologized for his mother's cruelty and the ripped check. He promised me that we would find a cheap studio apartment by morning. He was ready to sell his watch just to pay a security deposit. I felt like a monster as I watched him suffer. He was mourning a family that I had easily dismantled. I reached out and touched his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. I told him we could stay at my place for now. He shook his head and mentioned my tiny apartment wasn't safe for Rosie. He believed the plumbing was failing because I had complained about repairs last week. In reality, my penthouse had 3 bathrooms and a view of the skyline. I had to maintain the lie. The test wasn't over. Graham's phone began to buzz. It was a call from his father, Randall. Graham hesitated, then put the phone on speaker. Randall's voice was surprisingly calm and low. He told Graham that Patricia was hysterical, but he shouldn't come back tonight. He mentioned that Sloane was already digging into my past with a private investigator. My heart skipped a beat at the news. A professional investigator would find the truth in hours. My $17,500 salary was public record in medical journals. Graham thanked his father and hung up. He looked at me with fresh worry in his eyes. He said we needed to leave the city until the heat died down. He wanted to protect me from his sister's malice. I realized the stakes had changed from a simple test to a hunt. I had to decide if I should confess now or run. The weight of the secret felt like a physical burden. I looked at the sleeping baby. We drove to a 24-hour diner to clear our heads. The smell of burnt coffee and grease filled the air. I went to the restroom to check my bank app. I transferred funds to an offshore account, just in case things got legal. I saw my balance was nearly $500,000. I could buy Graham a new life 10 times over. I walked back out and saw a man watching our booth. He held a camera. The man was dressed in a dark hoodie and sat by the door. He didn't order food or look at a menu. He was focused entirely on Graham and the baby. I realized Sloane hadn't waited for morning to hire help. We were being followed by a professional. Graham noticed my stiff posture and turned around to look. The man stood up and walked toward the exit. He dropped a manila envelope on our sticky table. The yellow envelope sat between us like a ticking bomb. Graham stared at it, his fingers hovering over the flap. Outside, the diner's neon sign buzzed with a rhythmic, dying hum. He pulled out a stack of glossy photographs. They showed me walking into the dental lab in a designer suit weeks ago. Another shot captured me driving a luxury car I had supposedly sold. The mystery of my identity was unraveling on a sticky table. Graham flipped through the images, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. He looked at me, then back at the photos. He asked if these were recent. I nodded slowly, my throat tightening until I could barely breathe. He didn't explode with anger. Instead, he looked profoundly hurt. He realized the woman he defended was a stranger. The silence in the booth was heavier than the insults at the mansion. I saw his trust shatter. Suddenly, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Two men in suits stepped out and walked toward the diner. I recognized them as my private security team. They were supposed to stay invisible unless the situation became dangerous. Their presence meant the lab emergency was more than a technical error. It was a threat to my safety. Graham watched them through the window, his eyes narrowing. He asked if they were coming for me. Security lead entered and nodded to me with professional respect. He ignored the greasy atmosphere and the shocked man sitting across from me. He stated that we needed to move now. The Whitmores had filed a police report claiming I kidnapped Rosie. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was a vicious move to seize control of the narrative. Patricia was playing for keeps. I realized then that my test had backfired. I stood up and grabbed the baby's bag. Graham stood too, but he stayed on the other side of the table. He asked who these men were. I told him they were my employees. His laugh was short and bitter. He said he didn't know which lie was worse anymore. The security team formed a perimeter around us. We moved toward the exit in a tight, tense group. The night air felt like a slap. We reached the armored SUV parked at the curb. The engine was already running, a low rumble beneath the pavement. I urged Graham to get in. He hesitated, looking back at his own modest sedan. He realized his life was being swallowed by mine. He climbed into the leather interior with a look of pure resignation. The door closed with a heavy, muffled thud. We were safe from the street, but not from each other. The driver pulled away, heading toward the city center. I watched Graham stare at the partition glass. He wouldn't look at me or the baby. My phone chimed with a video call request. It was Nana June, and her face was illuminated by a single lamp. She looked worried. She told me the police were already at my penthouse. Patricia had given them the address she found in the envelope. The game was truly over. The SUV sped through the city as the skyline blurred into streaks of neon. I watched Nana June's face on the screen. Her image flickered with the weak signal. She warned me that Patricia was using the kidnapping charge to freeze Graham out. It was a calculated move to break his spirit. Graham sat in the shadows, his face like stone. He asked June if his father knew about the police. She nodded and then the call died. We arrived at my dental lab instead of the penthouse. The building was a fortress of glass and steel. My security team led us through the side entrance. The air inside was sterile and smelled of ozone. I had to fix the reconstruction case to maintain my standing. It was my only leverage left against the Whitmores. Graham walked behind me, looking at the high-end equipment. He realized my world was far larger than his. I felt exposed. The lab lights hummed as I grabbed my tools. I began to work on the ceramic bridge with steady hands. Graham watched me from the doorway. He didn't ask questions about the money or the lies. He just watched the precision of my movements. I explained that I was a senior specialist. He looked at the microscope and the digital scanners. The truth was finally sitting between us. He realized I never actually needed his protection. It hurt him. A notification flashed on the wall monitor. The front gate was being breached. I looked at the security feed and saw black SUVs. They weren't police vehicles. They belonged to the Whitmore security firm. Even though Patricia had filed a report, she was circumventing the law by using her own men to take Rosie back. She wanted the child as a trophy of my failure. Graham stepped toward the monitors, his eyes wide. He realized his mother had lost her mind. The situation was no longer a social game. I grabbed my bag and motioned for Graham to follow. We moved toward the roof access stairs. My heart hammered against my ribs with every step. I told him we had a helicopter waiting at the pad. He stopped and looked at me with pure disbelief. He asked how deep this rabbit hole went. I told him I had built a life he couldn't imagine. He stayed silent and kept moving. We reached the heavy metal door. The wind on the roof was freezing and loud. The helicopter rotors were already spinning, cutting through the dark air. I saw the lights of the approaching cars below. We were seconds away from being pinned down. Graham held Rosie tight against his chest. He looked at the machine and then at me. He had to make a final choice. He stepped onto the skid without a word. We rose into the air as the sirens arrived. We flew over the city, heading toward a private airstrip. I watched the grid of lights below us. Graham finally turned to me, his voice barely audible over the engine. He asked if the baby was actually mine. I hesitated, the lie sticking in my throat. I told him the truth about Tiffany and the arrangement. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back. He realized everything was a construct. Then the pilot shouted about a drone. The drone buzzed like a hornet against the helicopter's glass. It was a high-end surveillance model equipped with a blinding spotlight. The pilot swerved, sending a jolt through the cabin that made Rosie wail. Graham gripped the seat, his knuckles white as he stared at the intruder. I realized Patricia's reach extended to the very sky. She wasn't just following us. She was hunting us with military-grade precision. I pulled a tablet from the seat pocket to jam the signal. The screen flickered red, indicating a struggle for control. Before I tapped the glass to initiate a bypass, the drone finally wobbled and spiraled toward the dark rooftops below. We were clear. But the silence that followed was far worse than the noise. Graham looked at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He asked where I learned to fight like a ghost. I didn't have an easy answer that didn't involve more secrets. I told him that wealth attracts vultures. He leaned away from me, clutching the borrowed baby. We landed at the private airstrip 10 minutes later. A sleek jet waited on the tarmac, its engines whistling in the wind. My ground team moved with silent efficiency, transferring our bags. Graham stood on the asphalt, refusing to board the stairs. He looked at the luxury aircraft as if it were a trap. He told me he couldn't go through with this. He wanted the truth before the cabin door sealed. I stood on the bottom step, shivering in the cold air. I explained that the kidnapping charge was a lie designed to keep us running. Patricia knew Rosie wasn't mine, but she used the paperwork to create a legal storm. I had to get us to a neutral state to fight back. Graham asked why I didn't just tell him months ago. I told him I was afraid he would love the money instead of me. He laughed, but there was no joy in it. He said I never gave him the chance to choose. Suddenly, a motorcade of black sedans roared onto the runway. They boxed in the jet, tires screeching against the painted lines. Patricia stepped out of the lead car, her face a mask of triumph. She held a phone up, recording the scene for her lawyers. She shouted that the game was over. She had a court order for the child's immediate protection. My security team surged forward, hands on their belts. The standoff was electric. The wind whipped Patricia's hair. Randall stepped out of the second car, looking exhausted. He walked toward the middle ground, raising his hands for peace. He looked at Graham, and then at the armored jet behind me. He told Patricia to stop the madness before she ruined their name forever. She ignored him, demanding the police move in. I realized she had local officers with her this time. This wasn't a private feud anymore. It was a public arrest. I felt the cold metal of the jet's rail. I stepped down the stairs and faced the flashing lights. I told the officers to check the digital signature on the court order. I had my lawyers working on the counter, suit for hours. A notification hit the lead officer's phone. He looked at the screen, then back at Patricia. He told her the order had been vacated by a higher court. Patricia's face crumbled into a mess of wrinkles. Her power was evaporating in the bright hangar lights. She had finally lost. Graham walked past me toward his mother. He stood inches from her, his shadow long on the concrete. He told her she was dead to him. There would be no reconciliation or hidden inheritance. He was a Whitmore in name only from this night forward. Patricia tried to speak, but her voice was a thin rasp. She reached for his arm, but he pulled away. He turned his back on the empire she built. He walked toward me with a heavy, final step. We boarded the jet as the sedans retreated into the dark. The cabin was silent except for the soft hum of the air. Graham sat across from me, the baby finally asleep in his lap. He looked at the gold trim and the silk pillows. He asked if anything about our life was real. I told him the way I felt about him was the only truth I had. He didn't smile. He just stared out the window at the disappearing runway. The plane leveled off at 30,000 feet. I reached into my bag and pulled out the real engagement ring. It was a flawless stone that cost more than his car. I held it out, my hand trembling with a new fear. I asked him if he could still love a woman who owned the world. He looked at the diamond, then back at my eyes. He took the ring and dropped it into his pocket. He said we had a lot to discuss. The cabin pressure popped in my ears as we chased the dawn across the state line. Graham's silence was a heavy, physical presence that felt more dangerous than Patricia's threats. He watched the real diamond in his palm, the light dancing across the cabin walls. I waited for the explosion, the anger, or the rejection. Instead, he simply closed his hand tight. He asked if the dental lab was just a front for something else. I explained my professional world was built on honest, meticulous labor. I reached for his hand, but he pulled back to check on Rosie. The baby was a tiny island of peace in our wreckage. He asked about the money again, his voice cracking with a hidden exhaustion. I told him about the years of 16-hour days and the clinical patents. I earned every cent of that $17,500 monthly salary. He looked out at the clouds, his expression unreadable. He realized I was the provider now. The role he cherished was gone. He felt useless. We landed at a remote airstrip in the desert, just after sunrise. The heat hit the fuselage like a physical blow. My local team had a dusty, a nondescript SUV waiting by the hangar. I needed to get us to the safe house before the news broke. Graham climbed into the back seat without checking the perimeter. He was moving like a ghost in his own life. I took the wheel and drove toward the mountains. The asphalt shimmered with a deceptive, watery heat. About 10 miles in, a white truck began to tail us. I watched the rearview mirror, my pulse spiking against my throat. Graham noticed my grip tighten on the steering wheel. He asked if his mother was still following us. I told him it was unlikely given the legal block. The truck sped up, weaving through the morning traffic. I realized then that Patricia wasn't the only threat. My professional rivals knew I was vulnerable. My patents were worth millions on the black market. I swerved onto a dirt track, sending plumes of dust into the air. The SUV jolted over the rocks as Rosie started to scream. Graham held her tight, his eyes wide with a new terror. He asked what was happening. I didn't answer because I was focused on the terrain. The white truck stayed on our tail, closing the gap. I reached into the glove box for the emergency transponder and flipped the switch to call for an extraction. But the canyon walls blocked the signal. We reached a dead end at the mouth of a canyon. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding in the loose sand. The white truck stopped 20 yards back, blocking our only exit. Two men stepped out, but they weren't wearing suits. They wore tactical gear and carried heavy cases. I realized they weren't after the baby or my heart. They wanted the digital drive in my bag. It contained the schematics for the new reconstruction alloy. My secret was a target. Graham looked at the men and then at me. He saw the fear I couldn't hide anymore. He asked if this was my real life every day. I nodded. The weight of my success finally crushing us both. He didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the car before I could stop him. He stood in the sun, shielding the SUV with his body. He told them to stay back. He had nothing left to lose. The men laughed and drew their weapons. I felt sick. Suddenly, a loud whistle echoed through the canyon walls. A figure emerged from the rocks above the gunmen. It was Randall, Graham's father, holding a hunting rifle. He looked different in the desert light, harder and more capable. He told the men to drop their gear. He had been tracking us since we left the hangar. I realized then that Randall had his own secrets. He wasn't just a quiet husband. He was the one who kept the Whitmores safe for decades. The gunmen dropped their cases and retreated to their truck. They knew the odds had shifted. Randall climbed down the rocks, his boots crunching in the sand. He walked over to Graham and gripped his shoulder. He told him he was proud of the choice he made. Graham didn't move, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked at his father as if seeing him for the first time. I stepped out of the SUV, my hands trembling. We were finally safe. Randall looked at me and then at the baby. He told us the safe house was 5 miles north and had been stocked with everything we needed. He promised to hold off any pursuers and handle the men in the white truck while we made our escape. I thanked him, but my voice was a thin whisper. He nodded once and turned back to his own vehicle. We were alone again in the heat. Graham looked at me, the ring still in his pocket. He asked if there were any more surprises. I nodded. We drove in a tense, dusty silence until the destination appeared. The safe house was a low structure of stone and glass. It sat hidden in the shadow of a jagged ridge. Inside, the cool air smelled of cedar and old paper. Graham set the diaper bag on a heavy oak table. He pulled the diamond ring from his pocket and set it next to a lamp. The stone flashed with a cold, mocking brilliance. We stood in the quiet room while the desert heat hummed outside. I waited for him to speak first. Graham walked to the window and watched his father's dust trail vanish. He asked if I ever planned to stop the game. I told him the truth about my fear of being used. Success had always felt like a target on my back. He turned around. His eyes tired but clear. He told me he loved the girl in the clearance sweater. He didn't know if he could love a doctor with a private security force. My heart sank at his words. I stepped closer and took his hands in mine. I explained that the money was just a tool for safety. It bought us this house and the jet that saved us. Graham looked at the luxury watch he still wore. He realized his own family's wealth was built on far darker secrets. Randall had spent a lifetime cleaning up Patricia's messes. My lies were born from survival, not malice. He took a long breath and looked at me. He was finally starting to see the woman behind the mask. Suddenly, the front door creaked open. I had messaged her the safe house coordinates during the flight. It was Tiffany, looking weary and carrying a small suitcase. She looked at Rosie and then at us. She told us she was taking the baby to Florida. Her parents were waiting at the border to start a new life. The arrangement was over because the danger was too real now. I felt a sharp pang of grief as she reached for the child. Rosie was the glue that held my lie together. Now she was leaving us forever. Graham watched Tiffany walk toward the SUV. He didn't try to stop her or argue. He realized the test was over for everyone involved. We stood on the porch and watched the car pull away. The silence of the desert was absolute and heavy. Graham reached out and took the ring from the table. He didn't put it back in his pocket. He held it out to me with a steady hand. He asked if we could start over with no more secrets. I nodded and let him slide the diamond onto my finger. It felt different this time. It was heavy with the weight of the truth. He told me we would build something real from the ruins. I looked at the horizon where the sun was finally setting. My $17,500 salary didn't matter, in the dark. We walked back inside and locked the door against the world. Then, I saw a familiar black car pull into the driveway, trailing a cloud of dust. Despite Randall's efforts, Patricia had found the safe house.